Thank you very much for joining us today on our panel, The Future of Industrial Control System Security. There's increasing connectivity and digitalization that have the potential to change ICS environments faster than in the past. So what needs to be done to protect tomorrow's critical infrastructure? And what's the role of data ops in building a robust and reliable set of cybersecurity defenses? Today, I'm psyched to be here with Dale Peterson, who has helped to secure hundreds of companies' industrial control systems in every sector: oil and gas, water, manufacturing, mining, building automation, and now with Industrial 4.0 as well. Most of Dale's clients are large organizations with tens or hundreds of industrial control systems that are creating and improving ICS security programs. Most have been clients for 5 years, so he's seen their evolution. In 2007, Dale created the S4 conference because there really wasn't an event where the digital security and research community could come together and present and have an audience that really understands that content. This event has grown from a 2-day, 35-person event to a 3-day event over 3 stages with over 700 people that occurs every January in Miami, which is not a bad place to go in January. I'm Susan Peterson. I'm an IoT board advisor to Cognite, as well as Industry Ventures and nonprofit One Warm Coat. I've spent 20 years in automation, IoT, and cybersecurity, specializing in change management, product management, M&A, and strategic alliances. So Dale, welcome to the session.
Oh, thank you so much. I love talking about the future.
Heck yeah. All right. So let's start with a quick lightning round. Since the 1990s, the Purdue model has provided a hierarchical structure to secure industrial communications through defining how industrial automation networks should be segmented and how machines and processes should function and interact. In the age of IoT, data flow is no longer as hierarchical, and there are a lot more players in the tech stack. So if the Purdue model is dead, what will the new architecture look like? And how will it be secured? So I'd love your take on that, given that, lots and lots more tech in the stack these days, lots more players.
Sure. Well, it's funny. We did a session on, is the Purdue model dead at S4? And if you Google S4 Purdue model, you'll see that video. What we quickly realized was that the Purdue model was a functional model, and that model's not dead. So there will still be physical sensors and actuators at level 0. There still will be basic control at level 1, PLCs, controllers, and other things. So from that standpoint, the purpose of the Purdue model was dead, but it had morphed. I think you were right. It had morphed into an architecture. So people viewed the Purdue model as an architecture, and you'd see all these diagrams where they'd show a firewall between level 3 and level 2. And another one, maybe 3.5 with the DMZ. And that is dead. Or if I guess it's dying would be more accurate. There still are a lot of architectures, probably the majority based on the Purdue model. But we know now that, especially starting at level 2, that's going to be all over the place. Some of that's going to be in the cloud. Some of that's going to be at a business partner. Some of level 1 is going to be places it wasn't with IoT, and level 0 the same. So in that sense, I completely agree with you. So after babbling like that on the lightning round aspect of it, I thought of 3 things that are going to change with this new architecture. First of all, from a security standpoint, that people are going to be looking at zero trust for this distributed architecture, since we can't just say we're going to have a zone and control what goes between one zone and another zone. So that's pretty natural. And the buzzword is overused, but that's one thing we could talk about. The other one that isn't happening that I think needs to happen is restricted capabilities. So even if, let's say, this level 1 device somewhere is talking to a level 2 device somewhere, and that is authorized communication, it probably should only be talking certain commands. For example, maybe this should not allow someone to upload firmware.
Yeah.
Maybe this should only allow them to change certain things. And I have some examples of where that is, but right now it's kind of we'll give you access and just trust you to be right. Yeah. And I think that's an area that we need to worry about. And then the last area that I wrote down was, I think that you're going to see this is really going to drive process variable anomaly detection. So we're going to rely a lot more on modeling of the system and saying the system isn't operating right. So those were the three things that kind of, I think, the change in architecture is going to drive. I'm curious what was on your list.
Yeah. So
if anything.
I see, I mean, on one hand, right, it's really fun to be in the space and see all of the awesome built for purpose IoT sensors and controllers that are coming out that solve, thorny problems. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, sometimes I see that like Secure by Design didn't go into it, and it terrifies me. So I think the future is much more of like a mesh, right? And I also think about remote workforces and some of those other challenges, and it feels like we're kind of pushing potentially technology debt forward in this model. And so to me, I think it's really how can we think about security features built in and have enhanced device level security. So things like having identity management, encryption, and firmware built on the device. I think about companies like Finite State that are trying to enhance security out of the gate for these kinds of companies. And I think the big thing is trust, right? We want to create these trusted environments, trust in the context of safety, security. So I hope that process becomes a lot easier as we build our ecosystems, and we can define that. And further, to your point about like anomaly detection and looking at other trends, that we really think about how, I think about operations folks, right? And the operation mentality towards safety, they own it, right? They own safety. They're totally behind it. I can't say the same is true in security yet. And I think that we've got a ways to go to providing that kind of kind of interconnection point for folks that are doing security operations, for folks that are doing incident response, giving that common version of truth. So I get really excited about having that OT data up across the enterprise and accessible and out of those silos. And, to that end, sometimes the Purdue model helped enforce some siloed views, which wasn't the intention. So those are the things that I get pretty excited about.
Well, let's pull on that trust thread a little bit, because that was what I'm most concerned about, I think, right now. And I'll just give you an example that I ran across a couple of years ago. A very large U.S. company vendor was offering a boiler management system and then a boiler management service. It was actually a great service in the sense that they would go in, they would monitor, the data would be sent up to them in the cloud, they would look at it, and occasionally they would modify the boiler settings so it would be more efficient. And they were doing predictive maintenance, of course, but they were actually had some control capability. They had, now this is where we get into trust. They had a trusted relationship between the utility and the vendor. They had a secure tunnel. They had policies and procedures. They had all this sort of thing in place. But to me, that's not, that trust then extended. The only thing to restrict them to doing what they were supposed to do and nothing more was that trust. They had access into the guts of the system. They had protocols that would have allowed them to do anything they wanted, not only on the boiler management system, but it was networked to other systems. And this was a really hard thing to deal with. And I've worked with asset owners and the people providing the service. There seems to be little appetite to restricting that trust. For example, what we ended up doing was putting in a Tofino that said you can run these commands and only these commands, and restricted them that way. But the vendor doesn't want to, or the provider a lot of times of the service doesn't want to do this because it restricts what they can offer in the future, and it adds complexity to the project.
Yeah.
The asset owner sometimes doesn't even know they should ask for it, and it adds complexity to the project. So they would much rather say, we trust this partner and we're going to allow them into our crown jewels. And that trend I'm really worried about now. I'd really like to see people providing these services have a way of restricting what's allowed in that trust. And this applies to remote workforce as well. okay, yeah, you can come in and maybe you can tweak these things, but hey, you can't change settings on this item.
Yeah.
And I'm just seeing this trust is more person and device based rather than function based, and that's an area I worry about.
Yeah, I worry about that too. And I think that if we can't find a way to have that discussion around restricted capabilities, right? Because there is this notion of like having keys to the kingdom, and that idea of like privileged access in the OT world. Physically you can access anything. So I think it's like a legacy mindset that you should be able to go the equivalent, put hands on things, and it doesn't serve us right now, right? Especially if we think about even as energy or asset operators embracing more remote. So to me it seems a little bit like tickets to the dance. Like we really have to figure that out if we're going to evolve some of our workflows and teams. It's got to be part of it. And then the other piece I think about again on the trust is how powerful would it be if there's an event, to understand, for a SOC to understand, okay, well, here are the access rights that this vendor has. Are they within that zone? And being able to articulate that, because, frankly, I have worked at some OEMs where we've gone on and done things, and maybe messaging or communication hasn't gotten to a second shift or something in operations, and we've had alarmed calls from operations saying, what did you guys do? So
Yeah.
even from a very like functional level, I think it would be very helpful to have that visibility about kind of those, again, privilege access. And then if you're looking at events, if they're operational or security events, having that visibility is incredibly powerful. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to embrace remote teams and this kind of different workforces if we don't figure this out, right? Because I think it's a new modality we have to have.
Well, just a quick comment, and we can move on if you like. But I have seen strong examples of visibility for forensics purposes and other reasons, and even some alarming on that visibility. And in remote access, I will say I have seen some solutions now, and they've been implemented, especially in the COVID world, where they are restricting users quite a bit for remote access, and you can even get very granular if they choose to implement that. I guess where I'm seeing it less is in the typical cloud services that people are trying to roll out, where it's just a big VPN pipe in and out. But there are a lot of people doing remote access. Hey, we trust this person. He's been authenticated. She's been authenticated. Let's let her in.
I've seen that a lot. But again, I think it's thinking about those workflows, right, and how you're gonna navigate them with greater reliance, day to day in remote teams. All right. Well, that's a pretty good segue into kind of my next topic, which is we've talked a lot about, information technology, operational technology, convergence, and, how enterprise level technologies like data ops could help drive greater collaboration around security challenges across enterprise. So, I'm curious from your view how, you think data ops could help on the, current roles that we have, or, helping, even in future roles or in workflows, your view about how that could be of assistance.
Now, you're talking mainly about the security side of it, or just, on the security side? Well, I think one of the early wins is, and we're seeing some pilot projects, and I think even the host company has done some of this in terms of resilience and orchestration support. One of the things that a lot of asset owners aren't very good at is really knowing how long it will take them to recover, because they have resilient or redundancy that they rely on. And things just don't go down that often. So they say, well, if this goes down, it fails over to here or to this site. But if a cyber incident occurs and everything goes down, and certainly Colonial Pipeline has made people aware that such a thing potentially could happen, even if it didn't get to OT. I think a lot of these data ops, because they're creating these almost digital twins or similar, are going to really help. And the DevOps approach, help us rebuild, tear things down, build things up. And I'm actually really excited about the potential of this extending to level 1.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for the success with these edge devices to get people to realize, my PLC should look a lot like an edge device as a container with a bunch of IO.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it's not something that I have to, don't touch it. Don't look at it wrong. It's going to take us years to replace. I'm thinking once we get to containers at level 1, we actually finally get a secure level 1. That's another side benefit, but also resiliency, I think, is a huge win. And I see you wanting to chime in there, so I'll let you go for
you're just
a little bit before I ramble more.
It's really good. I think about, I think that like set it, forget it mentality is dead. So I'm smiling when you said like, don't even look at that device, don't touch it, and especially, I don't know, I feel that coming from power markets, right, where being able to have response times to play in lucrative ancillary services markets or that kind of thing, just markets can pivot and shift very quickly. And so I smile because, that kind of DevOps approach is important, right? And I think as asset owners, we need to start thinking about our IoT stack or our automation stack more in that context, right? Because roles are going to change, ways that we make money are probably going to change, right? So having that DevOps mindset. So I think about that a lot, and having that flexibility, which is very different than, I get my spare parts for my spare cards every year and I'll do an upgrade in 25 years. Like that's dead. So I think we have to go in and pretend from or just from our operating mode that build that into our process. Right. So I think that's super important. The other thing that
and when you talk about, one thing on that, when you talk about convergence too, I think we have a cultural convergence, right, that's going on. And to me, this is the one area, probably the best area where I've seen it really get through to the plant managers and the people in charge, because once they start thinking about recovery time objectives, RTOs, and they start asking questions, they get very nervous with the answers. It's like, we think, or we would call the ICS vendor, or, we've never done that, or we've rebuilt from media or something like that. It's a harder sale to get them to DevOps right away, but to get them to the environment that would support DevOps and start to get them and then they see, how that can help them with change management. And just once they've had some experience, it's not the end of the world if we have to tear down and rebuild a PLC with a new firmware version, or our engineering workstation, or our DCS server, then they get there. But I think the easy win, if you're talking on the data ops side, is start talking to them about rebuilding an RTOs.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think the other thing that I keep thinking about is, when I, if I'm in, oil and gas sites or power gen sites, the number of operators who, like to code in their spare time, right, who are playing around on Python. And so I also think that kind of that data ops and that DevOps focus, maybe it's not, obviously not out of the gate on control, but like, how are we empowering our operations stakeholders, right? And I think thinking about enabling them to use that kind of technology, right, to shift and, to monitor different things, to do their own analysis, but to really empower those stakeholders. I think that's something that I get really excited about, because again, I think those kinds of silos can be really challenging. So making that accessible, and I think we're naive to think that folks in that space aren't playing around with that kind of tech, probably in their spare time. So that's,
and if you give them a simulator that they can actually play around with, then that's even better. Like, hey, let me try this. Okay, now let me try it over the data from the last, time we had an incident where I wish I had this piece of code. What happens then? I think that's really powerful.
Yeah.
And I guess one other area I'm really excited about, and this is, I'll just throw it out there as for something for people to consider, is this kind of the holy grail, I think, for ICS detection is process variable anomaly
Yes.
detection, where you say this sensor data, these commands, this whole thing doesn't make sense in our model. Something is wrong here, and it could be a security incident, it could be sensor failures, it could be comms issues, it could be all sorts of things. So it's just generic detection. If you want to see an example of this, you can, if you Google S4 Digital Ghost, GE actually had an example where they showed a power plant having sensor failure. The digital twin found it, and what they call Digital Ghost actually sent back, hey, this is what the sensor data really is.
Right.
And I think it's a really hard problem. We've seen people working on it since 2010. But to me, and this is not a near-term thing, but that's a potential huge win if we can ever figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I think about like I worked at an IPP company that had, was a kind of a big independent power company, and the power. So I think kind of back to data ops and helping solve that problem, right? The power and having the trading floor and the ops folks having the same common root, if it's something as simple as like heat rate, right? Having that common root, and how trading was talking, the measure they may be using is different, but the derivative is the same. And so I think a real challenge, I think data ops is going to get there to providing basically not only what's happening on the line, but the operational context and a common asset taxonomy. So powerful, right? The next step, I think, is creating a lens for the OT stakeholders to understand, have that security context around. So, well, I haven't patched the system, for example. We've just, and then here are the other parts of the risk equation. We've seen anomalous traffic. We've seen behavior, and help them say, I think I have a challenge. And likewise, how do you provide that to the SOC? So I think that data ops, frankly, getting out of the silos of the automation specific systems and getting it across and making that accessible and having that asset taxonomy, I think that's been a big stumbling block until now. So I'm hopeful that we'll see acceleration to solving that. But I think it's really for our colleagues in operations, giving them that lens, right? That is in their language, that makes sense, that it helps them really understand operational risk and context, and vice versa, to give that lens to the folks in the SOC as well.
It's funny though. I think the big wins for asset owners are going to be more what you talked about. They're going to be more the business wins than the security wins in data ops. I'm just thinking, I'm working with two asset owners. One has about 50 sites, another has literally hundreds of sites. They can't really compare the sites that much beyond just a P&L. And they would just have such huge wins if they could love it and they could dive in and say, why are these sites better? And they're all sorts of hodgepodge of different technologies, but they have the same purpose. Yep. So I think as data ops gets better at that, I think security, what we really need to think about is how we're going to secure all those big wins. And we'll get some wins from data ops security, but I'm more interested in, I guess I think maybe I'm more interested in, I think is more important because the bigger wins are there, is how to secure what the business drivers are going to be for data ops, as opposed to getting security out of data ops.
I think there's a lot at stake, right? So I agree with the focus on protecting it. I just from, I've had incidents on the OEM side, and I've done some of the simulation ones with really progressive asset operators, so a simulation of an event and seeing what would that look like? How long would that take? I think we can do better by bringing our colleagues in operations, and giving them a better basis, and being kind of, I want to move away from compliance and being highly prescriptive. And I would love to give them a lens on risk. And I think if we're going to, my objective, I call it a huge win, if we could really, again, have security be more like safety, that it's like our colleagues in O&M feel like, yeah, I get it. I understand how I impact this, I can make risk-based decisions. I think that would be, I hope data ops will enable that as a big win too.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're going to see people pushing in both directions on that. And they're both good places to grow your career.
Yeah.
I think they're both growing.
Well, Dale, thanks for this awesome conversation. I really appreciated the discussion, especially around kind of thinking about restricted capabilities as we get really much more heterogeneous tech stack. The future of roles, I think, was awesome, and really looking at how we secure that data for the big ones. Huge points. It was a pleasure speaking with you today, and I really appreciate your customer experience, bringing that in, as well as your what you're doing to bring the security community together. And we are looking forward to some more great OT sessions with, certainly with our Cognite event and also at S4 in 2022. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Susan.